Facility defendants present, all counsel are present, jury and alternates are present. Good afternoon. We are going to interrupt the testimony of our last witness, Ms. Sementilli, so that people can call another witness out of order. You call your next witness.
Dr. Oday Ukpo.
Testimony may give in the cause now pending before this court shall be the truth, the whole truth, and nothing but the truth, so help you God.
I do.
Thank you. Please have a seat and witness stand. And for the record, say and spell your first and last name, please.
Oday Ukpo, first name O-D-E-Y, last name U-K-P-O.
Thank you.
Proceed, please.
Doctor, can you please tell us how it is that you're employed?
I am the Chief Medical Examiner of the County of Los Angeles.
What is a medical examiner, please?
A medical examiner is a physician who his expertise is in determining the cause and manner of death, especially in cases of suspicious violent deaths.
Okay. How many years have you been at the LA County Medical Examiner's Office, which was previously titled the LA County Coroner's Department?
I've been employed by the Medical Examiner's Office for approaching 11 years, so 10 and a half years.
Okay. Tell us, if you would, please, about your training and education that qualifies you for your position today.
I received my medical degree from Loyola Chicago. I then went on to do a residency in pathology at the Barnes Jewish Hospital in St. Louis. I then went on to do a fellowship in forensic pathology at the Office of the Medical Investigator in Albuquerque. I am board certified in anatomical, clinical, and forensic pathology. I'm also licensed to practice medicine in California.
Can you define for us, explain to us what forensic pathology is?
Forensic pathology is a specialty in medicine where physicians determine both the cause and the manner of death. The cause of death is the event that caused everything to happen subsequently leading to their death. And then also in a medical examiner's office, the physician is tasked with determining the manner of death. And the manner of death is the circumstances where how the death happened. There are 5 different manners of death.
Okay. Approximately how many autopsies have you conducted?
Somewhere over 1,000.
Okay. And have you also testified many, many times regarding cause and manner of death?
Yes.
As an expert?
Yes.
I want to direct your attention back to January 26th of 2017. On that date, did you conduct an autopsy on a decedent by the name of Fabio Sementilli under what was coroner's case 2017-688 that is now a medical examiner case number?
That's correct.
And the age of the decedent, were you able to determine that?
The age of the decedent was part of the investigation that was provided to us, yes.
And was he 49 years old?
Yes.
And what about height and weight?
Height and weight was also taken as his body came to our office.
And what were those measurements?
I need to refer to my report to refresh my recollection on that.
Your Honor?
Of course.
I'm there and ready to answer.
Yes.
His height was 70 inches and he weighed 300 pounds.
70 inches would translate into what height?
So that is 5 foot 10 inches.
Okay. did you prepare an autopsy report with respect to your examination, observations, as well as diagrams and notations?
Yes.
And when an autopsy is conducted, such as in this case, were photographs taken at the time?
Yes.
And have you reviewed not only your report, but also the photographs that were taken prior to, during, and after autopsy?
Yes.
Okay. And do those photos accurately depict your observations?
Yes.
Okay. Your Honor, I have 16 documents, including photographs and diagrams. May they be marked collectively, please, as People's 231.
Yes.
Start by showing People's 231. There's a 5 in the lower left corner. Do you recognize what you see here?
Yes.
Does that also come up on the projector right there to your left?
The screen before me doesn't have it on.
Oh, I'm sorry. If you can just turn it on the top. That would have happened. Apparently someone shut off the...
We'll stay friends. Okay.
It's something's floating on the screen, but there's nothing. Oops, no, now you turn off. See, there's a little.
did answer the question.
Shall I proceed?
Please.
Show you what's been marked as People's 231. There's a 5 in the lower left corner. Do you recognize this individual?
Yes.
And how is it that you're able to recognize and identify a particular decedent that comes into the medical examiner's department?
By the unique medical examiner identification number at the bottom of the photograph indicating the year and the unique case number, as well as my recollection of reviewing for this case prior for testimony.
And with respect to the unique case number, that is 17-00688, correct?
Yes.
And that would also be a sequential number at the medical examiner's department, correct, for that year of 2017?
Correct.
Okay. Is it the standard practice at the medical examiner's office that any time a decedent is brought in and photographed, that the unique coroner's case number as it used to be, or now medical examiner's number, will appear in the photograph on some type of a placard?
That's correct.
Once a decedent such as Mr. Sementilli is brought in to the medical examiner's office, are photographs taken prior to the time any clothing is removed and the body is washed prior to autopsy?
Yes.
Showing you People's 231, there's a 3 in the lower left corner. Once again, looking at what you see here, is this another photograph of the decedent?
Yes.
And showing you People's 231 because of 4 in the lower left corner. Once again, same question.
Yes.
Showing you People's 231, there is a 1 in the lower left corner. Do you recognize what you see here?
Yes.
And can you know what, I'm going to put a larger version of that up. Starting at the top, can you describe for us, first of all, what you see here?
This is a diagram of the human body. It's not meant to replicate the person's position, but rather anatomical standard position where I take notes on my observations that I'm finding on the body and noting them here. That is before you in this diagram.
And so is this one of the standard coroner diagrams that is used at the time of observation and autopsy, onto which you would write notes simultaneously when you're observing or conducting your autopsy or soon thereafter?
Yes.
Okay. And can you tell us on this diagram, it's 20, diagram 20, but in the top left corner I see that in handwriting is written -2. Is this a diagram which contains your written notations?
Yes.
Okay. Did you want me to stop for a moment? can you tell us what you have drawn in on this diagram, consistent with what you observed?
Yes. On this diagram, there's a portion that is the left upper chest, which is near a nipple, near the nipple, and that is where I noted a stab wound of the chest. Also on the left arm, there are superficial sharp force injuries involving the arm, including the bicep.
And I note that pointing to the wound to the chest, the left chest as you've indicated above, it says SFI. What does SFI stand for?
It stands for sharp force injury.
And as you mentioned, when I was asking you about forensic pathology, you indicated that there are 5 different causes of death. Would sharp force injury be one of those?
I was referring to manner of death for the 5. There are several ways to die for cause of death.
Okay. And below where it says SFI, I see that you have indicated some measurements as well as direction and depth, correct?
Yes.
And we'll come back to that. Showing you 231. There's a 2 in the lower left corner, and let's start. This one has 2 diagrams. Number 21, and the other one 22. Let's start with 21. Do you recognize what you see here?
Yes.
And is this, once again, a diagram that contains your notation and signature?
Yes.
And I see that you have indicated SFI, and I think in parentheses it says 6. Is that correct?
In the parentheses is the letter G as in George.
Okay. And once again, beneath that, does it contain some information relative to your observations regarding depth, direction, and other information in terms of measurements?
Yes, depth, direction, and also characteristics of the edge of the wounds.
And if we look at this area that I'm pointing to here, where you have drawn a line, is that the area on the interior of the right leg, just above the knee?
Yes.
Looking at the diagram next to it, 22, to the right of 21, and 231, with the 2 in the lower left corner. Again, does this appear to contain your notations as well as your signature with respect to several sharp force injuries?
Yes.
What is a sharp force injury?
Sharp force injury is an injury due to something that is sharp.
Okay. Seems fairly self-explanatory. Showing you People's 231, where there's a 6 in the lower left corner. Again, is this the same decedent that we talked about, Mr. Fabio Sementilli?
Yes.
And again, is this a photograph that was taken at the Department of Medical Examiner?
Yes.
And what is it that we see here with respect to the right side of the face, the neck area and jawline?
On the right side of the face and jawline demonstrates the sharp force injuries of the neck and also on one on the face, essentially. And
we see that same set of injuries in People's People's 231, there's a 7 in the lower left corner.
Yes.
And again, in 231, there is the number 8 in the lower left corner.
Yes.
Looking at People's 231, that has a 9 in the lower left corner, I see that there are placards A, B, and C. Are those indicators that you placed for reference to your description in your autopsy report?
Yes.
Okay. Let's start by looking at number A. First of all, how many sharp force injuries in total did you observe?
There were a total of 7 either incised wound or stab wound, and then there were 2 additional superficial wounds on the left arm.
What is the difference between an incised wound and a stab wound?
An incised wound is where the surface of the injury is longer than it is deep. A stab wound is deeper than it is long.
Okay. So in looking at what you have delineated as A, can you describe this particular sharp force injury to us?
Yes. This is a stab wound of the face that's near the jawline, and there are 2 areas of the wound that look separate from each other, almost forming like a Y appearance to the wound.
Okay. What was the direction of this particular sharp force injury?
This one was from his back to front, and I need to refer to my report for the additional
Sure.
Directions. His right to left and downward.
So in a downward direction.
Correct.
So in this one you have 2 separate angles, as you mentioned. It's sort of in a Y shape. What does that indicate to you?
This indicates either the person holding the knife was moving as the knife came out in a different direction, so that's why you have 2 components, or the person being assaulted was moving as the knife was in them and it came out.
Okay. And were there, out of the 7 sharp force injuries that we're going to talk about, were 3 of those injuries consistent with being back to front?
Yes.
All right. And can you tell us what was the track or the wound track in this particular case?
This injury for the one labeled A went through essentially soft tissue, which is like muscle and fat, so no major organs or vessels were identified.
Okay. How deep was this particular injury?
I need to refer to my report for that
Sure.
detail. The depth was 2 inches for this one.
And I noticed in your report that you labeled this particular injury as sharp force injury 1. In terms of assigning a number, do those in any way correlate with an assumed order?
No.
So you number them for purposes of reference to your report?
That's correct.
Okay. In terms of each of the seven sharp force injuries, are all of these injuries consistent with a knife or knives that are single edged blades?
Yes.
What does that mean?
A single-edged blade will have such that one part of the stab wound has a sharp end where the knife is sharp, and the opposite end is blunt, which means that that side of the knife was not sharp. And so therefore it's consistent with a knife that is a single-edged blade.
Were any of the injuries specific to a particular area of the body, such as cartilage or bone, that would potentially preserve a tool mark or pattern?
None of the wounds have features that would suggest a tool mark pattern to be preserved.
Does that mean that if detectives, law enforcement were able to identify a potential weapon and submit it to the Department of Medical Examiner, there wouldn't be any injuries to compare a weapon to?
Correct.
Okay. When we talk about a single-edged blade, showing you what's been previously marked as People's 155, are we talking about any type of knife such as this that is smooth on one end and then sharp on the other?
Yes.
And in terms of this particular item, which has a serrated blade, as we see here, again, were there any tool marks to specific areas of the body, as I mentioned, like cartilage or bone, that would tend to preserve a potential pattern such as serration or a tool mark?
No, there are no features of the wounds where a specific tool could be matched to, other than the features of being a blunt and sharp edges is consistent with a single-edged blade.
Okay. So that's as much as you could tell with respect to the weapon, correct?
Yes.
Let's look at what you've delineated as B, or sharp force injury 2. Can you tell us about that particular injury?
Yes. This was a sharp force injury of the neck that was longer than it was deep, so it is an incised wound.
Okay. And you told us the difference between an incised wound and a stab wound. With respect to this particular injury, was there, again, both a sharp and a blunt edge?
Yes.
Okay. Again, as you said, consistent with a single-edged knife?
Yes.
Okay. And let's move on to what you've notated as injury C, sharp force injury 3. Could you describe that one for us?
The one labeled C is a sharp force injury of neck that is a stab wound, and this had a significant injury associated with it, which was the jugular vein and carotid artery were severed as a result of this stab wound.
Okay. So in this case, what was the depth of this particular wound?
I need to refer to my report briefly. The depth was 4 inches.
And what was the direction, please?
The direction went from his front to back, right to left, and downward.
If I were to ask you about this injury, is it possible that this injury, given the direction of the injury front to back, right to left, downward, the front to back portion of the injury, is that possibly consistent with being attacked maybe from behind?
I'm going to object, possibly is speculation.
It's a hypothetical.
It's overruled.
It's possible.
And how would an injury such as that potentially occur?
Just to clarify, if it from behind, you mean?
Yeah.
If the person is behind, it could be a strike that's extending out, but then coming back. Even though they're behind the person, it will be on the relative to their body, because that's what we talk about in our diagrams and injuries. It's relative to the body, not the person. And so in that scenario, someone can be behind and then the direction of the stab wound is going from their front to back because they're coming from their front to their back.
Could it be potentially consistent with, again, hypothetically, someone reaching around the front of the neck area?
Yes.
You mentioned that this one perforated the jugular vein as well as the right carotid artery. Are those injuries, perforations of the jugular vein and the carotid artery, immediately life-threatening?
Yes.
And did this particular injury cause bleeding into the trachea?
Yes.
So that would mean that, did you actually observe that there was blood being aspirated into the lung?
Yes.
So in that situation, just so that we can understand that in a common sense fashion, that would mean that he would be choking on his own blood.
Essentially, that would be the way that I think most people will understand what's happening when blood is getting into the windpipe.
Okay. And given that you saw aspiration of blood into the lungs, is that an indicator that this particular decedent was likely alive for possibly an interval of several minutes, not seconds?
The fact that there was breathing enough to essentially aspirate the blood indicates that the death didn't happen instantly. There are other components of this that tell me that it is minutes possibly for the length, but not this one.
And what is that, along with this particular factor?
In addition to studying these wounds, also look at the brain. And the brain, when you lose blood, the way it responds is that it starts to swell. And it takes some time for that to happen. That doesn't happen instantly. And so that feature is consistent with a death that happened over a course of minutes because the brain was able to respond for the need of oxygen due to lack of blood.
Okay. Showing you people's 231 with a 10 in the lower left corner. I see here that you have added a notation that this is wound D, or sharp force injury number 4. Can you describe this particular injury for us?
This is a stab wound of the right side of his neck, essentially behind the ear sort of region of the neck.
Okay. And what was the direction?
And I'll refer to my report again. This one was from his back to front, left to right, and downward.
Okay. And what was the depth of this particular wound?
The depth of this wound was 3 inches.
And that is, this would be described, we're looking now at the 2 photographs on that 231 with the 10 in the lower left corner. This would be, you described in your report as a gaping wound, correct?
Yes.
Showing you 231. There's number 14. The photograph on the right, is that a close-up that you have marked as F that we see in the photograph on the left?
Yes.
Can you describe this wound for us, please?
This is a stab wound of the left chest.
And what's the direction of this particular wound?
This one went from his front to back, left to right, and downward.
And can you tell us what the wound track was in terms of what the injury was internally?
Yes, the severe injury here was a stab wound through the heart that went to the depth of the interventricular septum, which is a kind of, think of a major wall within the heart. This was associated with bleeding around the heart, in addition to a significant amount of bleeding into the left chest.
Okay. And you said this was a depth of how many inches?
This one was a depth of 4 inches.
And given that you had bleeding around the heart cavity, was there also a large amount of blood that you observed during the course of your autopsy that was collecting in the left chest and the heart cavity where the lung sits?
Yes.
As such, would this be one of those injuries that I asked you about that would be immediately life-threatening?
Yes.
And that's because this is an injury to a vital organ or heart?
Yes, the vital organ, both for bleeding, but also the heart doesn't deal well with injury. It disrupts its electrical activity that it needs to pump. So there are 2 ways that this can cause death.
And would this be characterized as an injury where there was massive blood loss?
Yes.
When you said that this injury was 4 inches in depth and pierced the organ, the heart, showing you people's 231, there's a 15 in the lower left corner. Can you tell us what we're looking at here that I'm pointing to?
Yes. This is a photograph of the heart removed from the body, specifically the front part of the heart. In the middle, there's a defect, which is the stab wound through the heart that caused the bleeding.
And that the shape of this stab wound that we see here, is that the same shape that we see exhibited in People's 231, where there is a 14 in the lower left corner that you marked as F, injury F?
I would agree that the shapes are similar.
If we look at People's 231, where there's an 11 in the lower left corner from a different vantage point, is this the same injury that I'm pointing to here?
Yes.
And just below that, what is this injury that we see on the left arm?
That is a superficial wound consistent with a sharp instrument, but it's very superficial, much like a scratch.
Okay. And looking at People's 231, where there's a 12 in the lower left corner, is that also a close-up of these 2 injuries?
Yes, this shows the stab wound of the chest and also that superficial injury in the left arm.
People's 231, there's a 13 in the lower left corner. Looking at this injury here to the left neck, can you describe that injury for us?
Yes, this is a sharp force injury of the neck once again. However, this is on the left side.
Okay. So we have the sharp force injuries both to the right side of the neck, several to the right side, as well as one here to the left side.
That's correct.
And you described this as a V-shaped stab wound.
That's correct.
How would one sustain an injury such as this, as you described earlier, with there being potential for the knife moving, the assailant moving, or the victim moving?
So when the sharp instrument first gets inserted, if it comes out at a different angle, it can create another separate wound, but they're all part of the same wound, and that's why you can see two different components. Either it's the person wielding the sharp instrument moving, or the person being assaulted is also moving, so it can be either scenario.
Okay. Or both?
Or both, a combination of both, correct.
Okay. What was the depth of this particular injury?
The depth for this injury was 3 inches.
Okay. And what was the direction?
This went from his back to front, left to right, and downward.
Left to right or right to left?
Left to right, and downward.
Thank you. Looking at People's 231, there's a 16 in the lower left corner. Photograph on the right, does that appear to be a close-up of what we see on the left?
Yes.
And did you note this as injury G?
Yes.
And can you tell us what we're looking at here?
This is his right thigh, so approximate to the right knee.
And what was the direction of this particular injury?
This injury went from his front to back, left to right, and upward.
Okay. So that's a different direction than we've seen before. The other ones we were talking about a downward direction.
That's correct. This is the one that was upward.
Okay. So could this be consistent with an assailant striking up or the victim being close to or on the ground?
Yes, there are multiple scenarios that can be consistent with this, but essentially the blade is going upward.
Okay. And what was the depth of this injury, please?
For this injury, it was 4.5 inches.
And what was the path of the wound track?
This went from his front to back, his right to left, and upward.
Right to left.
Yes, I
before you
apologize.
said left to right, I just wanna make
yeah,
Okay.
thank you. It's right to left.
Okay. And what was injured or perforated in this particular case with respect to this sharp force injury that you itemized as G or 7 to the right thigh?
There was injury to the right femoral artery and vein.
Now, again, given that we're talking about a femoral vein and artery, just like we talked about the wound to the chest cavity, would that also cause a significant loss of blood in a rapid manner here?
Yes.
So again, would this be an injury that would be immediately life-threatening?
Yes.
All right. So in total, we talked about 7, I think, sharp force injuries. I think there's the 2 superficial and then the 5 stab or incised wounds, correct?
Just to clarify, there were 7 that were either stab wounds or incised wounds, and an additional 2
Sorry.
that were superficial wounds, also consistent with sharp force injuries,
Any? I'm sorry, go ahead.
bringing the total to 9.
9. Going back to the diagram number 22 that we looked at earlier in 231 with the 2 in the lower left corner. Did you make notations on your diagram with respect to 5 of them on this particular diagram?
Yes.
And if we look at diagram 21, this is the one we just talked about, to the femoral artery and vein, correct?
Correct.
And if we look at 20-2, as we talked about, this is the one to the chest, and then the two superficial wounds that we talked about to the area across from where the armpit is, and then on the left bicep, correct?
Correct.
All right. Did you observe anything on the hands, wrists area, or inner arm area that would be consistent, let's say, with a indication of a defensive wound?
I did not.
Okay. What is a defensive wound?
A defensive wound is a term in forensic pathology where the region of the body that's injured is something that would be expected when someone is trying to defend themselves from a weapon such as a sharp instrument.
So if one were to try to defend oneself or to ward off an attacker, generally the instinct is to put your hands up, correct?
Yes, to reach out the arms essentially to keep the person away, or to try to maybe even grab the implement, or whatever happens in that interaction. Sometimes there's an injury that happens as a result of that.
Given that you did not see that in this case, that there were no classic signs of defensive wounds to the hands, wrists, or arms, what would that indicate to you?
One scenario that is possible is that the person was not aware, maybe sleeping, maybe just not aware of what's happening, and that's one possible scenario. Because the expectation is to defend yourself and try to ward off somebody. So without that, it raises the possibility of that.
In other words, an individual who was taken by surprise and didn't have the time to register to try and protect themselves.
Correct, or they are somehow bound or something like that that's preventing them.
Okay. Is it also consistent perhaps with an individual who's unable to fight back because maybe they're being restrained in some manner, as you mentioned?
Yes.
Or another possibility that the person is overwhelmed by their attackers and therefore is unable to fight back. Would that also be consistent with the lack of a defensive wound, or wounds in this case?
In the event that they're overwhelmed, I can still expect to see defensive injuries. However, without that, it just raises the possibility of a surprise.
Also consistent, perhaps, with what we've talked about previously with respect to several of these wounds, that the person may have been initially attacked from behind, or someone with their arm coming around in front of the neck?
Your Honor, perhaps that's a speculation.
It's a pretty choice of words on the prosecutor's part, but that does not cover speculation.
Go ahead.
That's one scenario that's possible.
So what was the cause of death in this case?
Stab wounds.
Okay. Multiple stab wounds.
Just stab wounds.
Okay. But we talked about the fact that at least 3 of these injuries were immediately life-threatening.
Correct.
All right. And what was the manner of death?
Homicide.
And what does that mean in terms of a medical as opposed to a legal definition?
The medical term is that the death happened at the hands of another.
Now, is there also a protocol in place that a sample of blood is taken at or near time of autopsy as a matter of routine?
Yes.
And how is that prepared?
And the blood is drawn from the body and then placed into a container for preservation, and then sealed to maintain a chain of custody until it is submitted to the lab for further testing.
And was a toxicological screen conducted in this case?
Yes.
Is there any alcohol or indication of any common drugs of abuse detected?
None.
Typically, as in this case, is the blood that's collected also prepared on a bloodstain card that is sent to the relevant law enforcement agency for serological or DNA analysis?
Such a card is prepared in anticipation that law enforcement will come to pick it up for their evidence.
Okay. I have nothing further. Thank you.
Thank you, Your Honor. Dr. Ukpo, you testified before the grand jury, is that correct?
That's correct.
The testimony you gave today, was that the same in terms of accuracy as it was before the grand jury?
My recollection is that the testimony is the same, yes.
Okay. And when you testified before the grand jury, were you shown any photographs of potential weapons as you were today?
I don't recall that.
Well, if I told you in reviewing the grand jury transcript there was no reference to... Could I have the photograph, please, of 155, I believe it is? You recall being shown this photograph, which is exhibit 155, a few minutes ago?
Yes.
And were you shown this photograph at the time of the grand jury?
I don't believe so.
You gave testimony today regarding the sides, how sharp the sides of the blade would be or have to be, things of that nature. You recall that?
I'm going to object, Your Honor, that misstates the evidence. He didn't talk about
Excuse me, you're making a speaking objection. That'll be sustained.
Did you give testimony concerning the blade and how it would have appeared in terms of length, whether it was sharp or serrated? You recall that testimony here today?
Objection, Your Honor. The compound.
Sustained.
Part of it is true and part of it is not.
Dr. Ukpo, did you meet with either of the prosecutors before your testimony today?
Yes.
And which prosecutor? Or both?
I met with Beth Silverman.
And when did you meet with her?
I met with her today, and I've also met with her, I don't recall which day, but also over the telephone.
Okay. And did she show you the exhibit that has been marked People's 155?
Is this before me, Exhibit 155?
The one that's on your screen, yes.
No.
Have you ever seen that weapon before, that knife?
I have not.
But she asked you a question about that knife during your testimony. Is that correct?
I object. It's been asked and answered.
No, it has not. Overruled.
Yes.
And you gave some testimony concerning a serrated edge. Do you recall that?
Yes.
The knife that was used to kill Fabio Sementilli, according to your autopsy of his body, did that, well, Let me withdraw that. Your Honor, I have a document that is labeled Victim Sementilli Autopsy Exam amended.
I'm sorry, is this an autopsy report?
This is an autopsy report, and
Very good.
the number, Sementilli number, base number is 000332. And I approach.
You used to have that marked?
Yes.
621.
Thank you. Dr. Ukpo, do you recognize Defense Exhibit 21, which you said? 621.
I don't recognize this document.
Did you prepare it?
The preparation is not consistent with how I would put together documents, and it doesn't look familiar to me.
Do you see the name, the third line down from the top? It says Dr. Ukpo. Is that your name?
Yes.
Your Honor, can you approach?
All right.
Thank you, Your Honor. Dr. Ukpo, I think I misstated something that I was showing you, Exhibit 621. You've never seen that before, is that correct?
That's correct.
Before right now.
Before right now, that's
So
correct.
this is not an amendment to your autopsy report.
No, it is not.
In fact, you don't even really know what it is except what is written on it.
Yeah, the style just doesn't look like an official document, more like an email, maybe, if I were to speculate.
Okay. When you are was there only one autopsy conducted in this case?
Yes.
And by you?
Yes.
When you conduct autopsies, and let me just limit it to this case, was there a detective or anyone from law enforcement present during the autopsy, as I understand sometimes occurs in autopsies? Is that right?
Yes.
So it sometimes occurs, correct?
With certain cases, yes.
And just so the jury is educated, and I am too, for what reason would a detective be present during an autopsy?
Objection calls for speculation.
I'm a law witness, answer me knows. You answer, doctor.
The medical examiner's office, the goal is to prevent premature deaths, and so we often cooperate with agencies that are put in the position to help prevent premature deaths. And in this circumstance, law enforcement person is investigating the death, and so it is common when there's a homicide that they attend just to get information from me regarding my findings.
And information regarding your findings in the case that you were doing an autopsy on, correct?
Yes.
Okay. So I take it you've had detectives or law enforcement at previous autopsies you conducted?
Yes.
And in those autopsies, and I'm trying to get your protocol or procedure, do they ever take notes, to your knowledge, regarding the autopsy?
I often see the detectives taking notes. That's correct.
And when they take these notes, are they required, regarding your rules and regulations, to show you any reports they have prepared as a result of those notes?
Their notes are not needed for my portion of the examination, so I don't request the subsequent report that they generate.
Okay. Are you aware or not that they do take notes and prepare reports?
Yes.
Are you not concerned at all that the conclusions in those reports, if there are any, are accurate?
Objection. Irrelevant.
It's argumentative, just saying on that ground.
Is it your policy to review those notes to determine if the reports to determine if they're accurate?
Objection asked and answered.
No, we have our own independent process, so I don't require me to review their notes.
Well, let me get to this case that's before the jury and the court. Was there a detective or anyone from law enforcement, to your knowledge, present during the autopsy of Fabio Sementilli?
Yes.
Do you recall who that was?
Yes.
And who was that?
Detective Fillmore with the LAPD.
And do you know who Detective Fillmore is, other than his name?
I'm unclear what is meant by who he is other than his name.
All right, that's a poor question. Do you know if he was involved in the investigation of the death of Fabio Sementilli?
It's my expectation, yes.
Okay, did you
That calls for speculation.
Sustained.
did you
Strike, Your Honor.
Stricken.
did you specifically ask him why he was there?
I did not.
Do you recall whether or not he remained throughout the autopsy?
It is common practice that the detective remains for the duration of the autopsy. There are some circumstances where they leave maybe earlier, but I don't recall specifically for this case.
So you don't have any independent recollection whether Detective Fillmore Plourde, Plourde, stayed for the entire autopsy?
For the entire being all the way up to the point that I was done and leaving the autopsy, no, I don't.
Okay. During the course of how long did the autopsy take, if you recall, approximately?
I don't recall for this specific case. I may have that in my report here. I can derive it from my report, but otherwise I don't recall.
Would you mind, if it's in your report, finding it and letting us know?
I'll look at timestamps to see if I can do that.
Okay. You don't have the time to do it now, is that what you're saying?
No, I will look at timestamps to see if I can do
Oh,
that.
I'm sorry, thank you.
Do that now.
Okay, thank you. I didn't know if you said this evening.
I don't have the specific timestamps. However, a case like this would take me on the order of somewhere between an hour and a half approximately.
Okay. And do you take notes during the course of the autopsy?
Yes.
Do you keep those notes?
The notes are maintained in my the diagrams and then also my report.
So there's nothing independent you have, independent notes, other than what is in your official autopsy report, which includes diagrams?
That's correct.
At the conclusion of the autopsy, did Detective Fillmore Plourde ask you any questions?
The name I have is Fillmore in the record.
Okay.
I don't have the other name you mentioned.
I'll just call him Detective Fillmore, and you can assume I'm talking about the same person who was present at your autopsy.
Thank you. Can you repeat the question then?
Yes. Did he ask you any questions either during or at the conclusion of the autopsy as to your findings?
Yes.
And do you recall whether or not it was during the autopsy or after it had concluded?
It's the usual is during the course of the autopsy as things are being discovered, they're being shared.
So it's safe to say you don't have an independent recollection of this particular autopsy as to what you may have said or not said to Detective Fillmore?
Not specifically.
Okay. But the policy would be that during the course of the autopsy, well, let me find out. Is it that you orally state what you're finding as you write it down, or do you respond to questions of Detective Fillmore, or both?
In my interactions in this case is to share information about my findings. Questions posed to the detective is not part of the standard routine. I can't even remember a case where I had questions actually for the detective.
So, at least policy-wise, whatever Detective Fillmore may have prepared, and I take it you have not seen the report that has his name on it that I showed you, Exhibit 621, correct?
No, I don't have that report.
Okay. So what you're saying is what the standard procedure is, you will orally state your findings, and he takes notes, and then when he's done, you have no idea what he wrote or did not write in his report, correct?
That's correct.
Okay. So let me go through this and ask you if you made these statements to Detective Fillmore. Did you tell him that the victim...
Object, Your Honor. Robert is hearsay.
It's overruled.
Did you tell Detective Fillmore that the victim, Fabio Sementilli, sustained 7 total stab wounds in 4 different locations of the body?
That would be consistent with what's in my report, so I think that would be consistent.
Okay, what I'll be asking you is that an accurate statement?
So there are, speaking of 4 segments of the body, I would have to interpret what parts of the body that equaled 4 in this circumstance. There's the right side of the neck, the left side of the neck, the chest, and then the leg. And in that sense, I would agree that there are 4 parts of the body that were stabbed.
Okay. And now, parts is different than wounds. Isn't that correct?
Parts would be the region of the body which is distinct from a wound, yes.
A wound would be each individual, in the case of a knife, stab wound, correct?
Yes, there would be, wounds would be separate, yes.
How many total stab wounds did you find in the body of Fabio Sementilli?
So there were stab wounds of the...
Can you just give us the total? I'm sorry. Or do you need to count them up as you're doing this?
I think that I can do it one of 2 ways.
Either way you want, I'm
can
sorry.
have me look at, I can look at the report and give you the exact number.
Whatever you prefer,
Okay.
which I take it is to review the report.
Correct.
Okay.
Of the 7 wounds that were described, 1 was described as an incised wound, and then the other 6 were stab wounds.
So is it an accurate statement that in total the victim sustained 7 total stab wounds?
No.
The correct response or answer is 6, and then 1, what was the last one you labeled?
Incised wound.
And what's the difference between an incised wound and a stab wound?
An incised wound is where the wound is longer than it is deep.
So like if I were to cut my arm this way just superficially, it could be 8 inches long, but it would not be very deep. You know what I'm describing?
I believe so.
Okay, and your answer is?
If it's superficial, then that would be an incised wound because it's not very deep and it's just longer than it is deep.
And how deep approximately would it have to be before you would describe it as a stab wound?
That would be, in that circumstance of 8 inches, then it would be anywhere above 8 inches, then it would be qualified as a stab wound
You mean 8 inches in length?
in depth.
In depth?
Yes.
Were any of these wounds in this case 8 inches deep?
No.
Well, then I'm a little confused.
I could perhaps clarify.
Please.
It's relative to the wound as it's seen from the outside. If it's a stab wound, it goes deeper than it is long. So it's always relative to the wound, how it appears from the outside is what defines it as a stab wound or an incised wound.
Okay, thank you. I feel educated and a little stupid, but thank you very much. So, the statement that there were 4 stab wounds approximately 4.5 inches deep, I'm sorry, the statement there were 7 total stab wounds in 4 different locations is an accurate statement?
Again, been asked and answered, misstates the evidence.
So overruled.
Incorrect.
Okay. Correct answer is the 6th, and what you said the 7th was, correct?
6 stab wounds, and then 1 would be qualified as an incised wound.
And the statement in 4 different locations of the body, is that a description you used during the course of the autopsy?
That's not my common practice to use that sort of description.
All right. Is that an accurate statement?
If I were to describe how many parts of the body were involved, I would also include the arm that had those superficial wounds, so then therefore 5 regions of the body.
So you're confident that whatever you said that day aloud, if you did, to Detective Fillmore or in his presence, would have been 5 different locations if you were describing the locations of the wounds, correct?
If I was asked that question at the time, my answer would have been 5.
Or if you just said it out loud?
I'm going to object. Calls for speculation unless it has
That would be true, and the
I'll
doctor
rephrase
said
that.
that's not his type of language, counsel.
Okay. Dr. Ukpo, when a detective is present during the autopsy, are you verbally describing what you find to assist him in his notes as opposed to if no one is present and then you'd just be talking to yourself?
So yes, the information is provided to the detective, whether they're there or not. They can also receive my report after the fact, but commonplace is that they come during the autopsy.
And do you describe the results as you find them, or do they ask you questions at the conclusion or some other procedure?
It's rare for the detective to ask me questions. It is more of as a physician, sharing my findings of what I saw was significant that caused the death.
So you're confident in saying you would not have said in 4 different locations of the body?
It would not be my expectation that my answer would have been that.
All right. Did you indicate or state during the course of the autopsy that there was 1 stab wound in the left chest piercing the left ventricle chamber of the heart, which was a fatal wound?
I would say that that statement would be an interpretation of what I said.
Is it an accurate statement?
It is accurate, except for the word fatal is not one that I use in my practice.
So if the word fatal is there, it did not come from you.
The wording that I use is not fatal, yes. From
Did you use a word meaning that the wound by itself could have been the cause of death by itself?
Yes.
So, okay. The term fatal wound, though, is not used by you, but it's an accurate statement, correct?
I would not describe it as accurate. That's how I understand people would understand it, but that's not what I would say is accurate.
Can you tell me, if you would please, what the distinction would be between a fatal wound and what you found concerning that wound to the right leg? The left, did I tell you left chest or right leg? I'm sorry. Yes, left chest. I'm sorry. What would you say?
The wording I would use is immediately life-threatening injury because I think it gets rid of any potential confusion.
Okay. Concerning the right leg, did you indicate that one stab wound was approximately 4.5 inches deep, severing the femoral artery?
Yes.
That is an accurate statement.
Yes.
And would you characterize that as a fatal wound, or would you characterize it as what you just indicated?
Objection. Unclear.
Vague, is that your objection?
What?
Vague?
Yes.
It's overruled.
You understand the question?
Yes.
Can you answer it?
Yes.
Thank you.
I would describe that as an immediately life-threatening wound.
Just as you described the wound to the left chest, correct?
Correct.
Next, a wound to the right neck/face, 4 stab wounds right to left and downward. Let me stop there. Is that an accurate statement?
Overruled.
Each stab wound had its direction, and I believe the majority were in the direction stated.
Right to left and downward.
Yes.
But you're saying there may have been other wounds to the neck face area in addition to those 4?
The collectively describing them as all having the same features there are some directions that were consistent throughout for all of them, the 4, and the back to front was consistent and downward as well.
And all right, then we go on. 1 stab wound severed the carotid artery. Is that a correct statement?
The carotid artery, yes.
Carotid, I'm sorry. I should know that. I get the test every month. Carotid artery.
Correct.
And if it said fatal wound, you would use the language you've used with the other 2, immediately life-threatening. Is that a fair statement?
Yes.
And finally, an injury to the left neck, 1 V-shaped stab wound. Is that an accurate statement?
Yes.
Did you, in the course of your autopsy, estimate the length of the blade used by the murderer?
No.
Did Detective Fillmore ask you what the approximate or exact length of the blade was, or minimal length? Let me ask you this. Did he ask you any questions about the length of the blade used by the suspect regarding the stab wound in the victim's right leg?
There were no discussions about the length of the weapon that was used.
Do you, as you sit here right now, or in your notes, have an answer to the question of what the minimal length of the blade would have been to cause the stab wound in the victim's right leg?
No.
And you cannot give that answer even now at this time, reviewing your notes or anything else?
Correct.
the right leg injury would have to have been caused by a weapon that was at least 4.5 inches long. Is that a correct statement?
No.
The wounds, and we're talking about all the wounds, were they consistent with a one-sided edged weapon without a serrated edge?
Yes.
Meaning that every wound that you observed, let's stick to the ones that were the possible cause of death. How many of those were there? Was there 4 of those, or you tell me?
There were 3 that were immediately life-threatening.
Okay. Would they have to have been caused, or were they caused by a one-sided edged weapon without a serrated edge?
I couldn't answer it in that way as asked.
Did you make the statement, or is it an accurate statement, I'll leave it at that, that the wounds were consistent with the one-sided edge weapon without a serrated edge?
It would be consistent with that, yes.
Does that mean it could also be inconsistent with a weapon without a serrated edge?
That would be incorrect.
In other words, what I'm saying is, in this case, those wounds, would they had to have been caused, the life-threatening wounds, with a one-sided edged weapon without a serrated edge?
That's one possibility.
What's the other possibility?
The other possibility was that there was a serrated edge.
So you're saying, as you sit here today, it could have been caused by any type of knife with or without a serrated edge?
I would further qualify with a single-edged knife with or without serration.
Would it have to have had a minimal length?
No.
Did you tell that to Detective Fillmore?
That discussion would be very unusual in my practice, so I don't believe that would have happened here.
Okay. The victim sustained a shallow scratch or non-fatal laceration to the left armpit area, approximately 10 inches in length, running vertically. Is that an accurate statement?
No.
Were you asked to describe was there a shallow scratch or non-fatal laceration to the left armpit area?
The description words for what it is what I cannot agree to.
What can't you agree to?
The description of a laceration as the term.
If I took that out and said victim sustained a shallow scratch to the left armpit area approximately 10 inches in length running vertically, would that be an accurate statement?
That would be an accurate interpretation of what I shared.
So the word you have problem with is non-fatal laceration, is that right?
Correct.
Were you able to ascertain the order of the stab wounds you observed in the victim?
No.
Were you able to determine if there was more than one weapon used?
No.
Were you able to determine whether Fabio Sementilli was alive prior to all the stab wounds?
Yes.
And that's based on what?
All the wounds that were examined showed bleeding. In order for bleeding to happen, your heart has to be beating, that you're alive, and therefore these injuries happened while he was alive.
was it rapid bleeding that you observed in the course of the life-threatening wounds? Is that an act? Well, let me change that. Regarding the wound to the thigh, the wound to the jugular vein, the perforation of the right carotid artery, and the perforation of the left ventricle of the heart, would all those injuries be extremely severe and tend to bleed rather rapidly?
It's my expectation, because there are large vessels, including the heart, that the bleeding would be expected to be rapidly, although I don't observe the rate itself.
And was that your testimony that you gave at the grand jury, if you recall?
I don't recall what question was asked for that, and if that was my answer.
All right, let me give you the question and ask you if you answered yes. Given not just the thigh, the wound to the thigh that we talked about, but the perforation of the jugular vein, perforation of the right carotid artery, and the perforation of the left ventricle of the heart, again, would those all be injuries that would be extremely severe and tend to bleed rather rapidly? Do you remember that question?
I don't recall that specific question.
May I approach, Your Honor? Would you read, this is on page 47 of the grand jury, could you read just to yourself lines 20 to 26?
Yes.
Does that refresh your memory as to whether or not that question was asked of you at the grand jury?
Yes.
And was it asked, and was your answer yes?
Yes.
So would you expect death to have occurred in a very short period of time given those injuries?
The expected time frame would be minutes for the death to occur.
So minutes, not seconds?
Minutes, not seconds.
So, again, could you tell us what is your estimation of how long the victim lived from the first injury or first wound until he would have died?
It's on the order of minutes, given that the brain's response to blood loss had started.
Did you say previously about 10 minutes, or did I get that wrong?
That's incorrect.
Can you give an estimate of how many minutes based on these wounds to this alleged this victim?
No.
Would there be any way, other than if you were a doctor, for the murderers to know whether or not the victim, in this case Fabio Sementilli, was dead or not, and at what time that, well, he was dead, but at what time that occurred?
Objection. We call for speculation.
Sustained.
Also.
You were asked about defensive wounds, correct?
Yes.
Was there an approximate time when you would have not expected the victim to have been able to fight back in any way because of the severity of the wounds and the time that had elapsed in the bleeding?
I believe you're asking if he could have been incapacitated.
Yes, thank you.
There is, with the wounds that would have been bleeding, I don't have an expectation of when incapacitation would have occurred given these wounds.
But it would have to have been sometime within that 10-minute period, correct?
Sorry, Counsel, there was no 10-minute period.
I'm sorry. Do you have an estimated time of how long Fabio Sementilli lived from the moment of the first injury until he was dead?
The best estimate is an order of minutes.
But no more specific than minutes?
No more specific.
And it is your statement or testimony that there were no defensive wounds for whatever reason.
There were no wounds that would be classically described as defensive wounds observed.
Which means, in layman's lingo, he was not. There's no evidence that he was able to fight back because of the severity of the wounds. Is that a fair statement?
It's not based on the severity of the wounds, but rather just looking at the body if there were any defensive wounds, which I did not see any.
Okay, so that's based on the assumption that if he were able to, he likely would have fought back or resisted in some way.
I object, Your Honor. That causes something.
Sustained.
Well, you did give a statement that you would have expected, absent some occurrences like surprise or so forth, for there to be defensive wounds, correct?
Objection misstates the evidence.
There are scenarios that I shared earlier about someone who may not be able to have defensive wounds, yes.
Okay, and I'm not going to repeat that. You gave the reasons why, correct?
That's correct.
So, getting back to Detective Fillmore, you don't recall him asking any specific questions of you following the autopsy, is that correct?
No.
What is correct?
It's correct that I don't recall any specific questions at the end of the autopsy. Common practice is just a courteous thank you sort of discussion, but no further questions usually.
If there had been questions and answers by you, would you have made a notation of that in your notes?
No.
Do you know who Detective Fillmore is?
In what sense?
Have you ever come in contact with him before hearing his name today?
Yes.
And you know him how?
It's my recollection in my notes. I note who attended the autopsy, and I noted Detective Fillmore from LAPD. This was 8 years ago.
So your notes indicate, and your testimony would be that he did attend the autopsy, correct?
That's correct.
Did you have your note? Is everything you're testifying to today based on your notes as opposed to your actual memory and recollection?
This is based off of my efforts in the report to memorialize my findings, and so that is what I'm able to testify to.
Okay. So, as far as you remember, and according to your notes, once the autopsy was over, Detective Fillmore likely thanked you and left, correct?
That's correct.
And he never shared with you any of his notes or reports or anything that he had written down as during the course or after the autopsy?
Objection asked and answered.
Sustained.
Did you have any contact with Detective Fillmore again after that date regarding this case?
No, I have no other recollection.
Did you discuss, well, let me, forgive me if I asked this before. You have or have not seen the item Exhibit 621 before today?
I have not seen that document that's in your hands, no.
It was not brought up to you at all by the prosecution team, either the attorneys or the investigating officers prior to your testimony today?
No.
Was Detective Fillmore's report or name, well, let me break it down, was his name mentioned to you at all during the course of your preparation for your testimony today?
No.
And were any of the findings that I have gone through with you in his report, or notations in his report, mentioned to you or discussed with you in any way with the prosecution or its team prior to your testimony today?
Objection assumes facts not in evidence.
Sustained.
I read to you the contents of this report. You recall that?
Your Honor, I'm going to object again. No.
It's overruled. That's to that.
Objection rescinded.
Overruled. That's to that.
You can answer.
I recall portions of it being read to me. I don't know if the entirety was read to me.
And you're talking about right now in court.
That's correct.
Did any of that occur during the course of, or before you testified today? Any reference to this report at any time, or Dr. Phil, or Detective Fillmore's attendance at the autopsy?
Not prior to my testimony. It's my first time seeing that document.
And the first time the findings I read to you were discussed?
I'm going to object as to the term findings, Your Honor.
Sustained.
First time the contents of Detective Fillmore's report, which I've gone through with you line by line, your testimony today is the first time you become aware of that, correct?
Objection assumes facts not in evidence.
Sustained.
Did anyone else discuss Exhibit 621 with you?
Objection asked and answered.
It's overruled.
That's the document that is in your hands there. No, this is the first I've seen it.
Thank you for your patience, and I have no further questions, Your Honor.
Just briefly. You don't work for the LAPD, do you?
I do not.
The medical examiner's department is an independent department. Is that correct?
That's correct, and that was part of the name change of our department to medical examiner to further assert that we have always been independent of law enforcement.
And if detectives choose to write notes, you have no knowledge what they put in their notes. Would that be fair to say?
No, I'm going to object. That's called for speculation.
Just- That's what she's saying. I will sustain it though.
Other than defense counsel showing you some piece of paper that you've never seen before, you, as you've said, you have no idea what the contents of any of the reports are in this case.
I do not.
And when you said that it's possible there is a serrated edge on one or more murder weapon, just as it's possible that there was not a serrated edge on one or more of the sharp objects, that's because, as we talked about on direct exam, there are no pattern marks or tool marks.
That's correct. There are some rare circumstances where a serrated blade can leave a particular mark, but that is absent in this case. And there were no injuries that would retain features that will point to any specific weapon.
I have nothing further.
And for living.
No, Your Honor.
Thank you, Doctor. You're excused. You know, it being pizza night, I think we'll take our adjournment now until Monday at 9 a.m. The admonition applies. You'll not discuss this case among yourselves or with anyone else. Inform or express any opinion of the cause is finally submitted to you. Enjoy the weekend.